let's come to some of the actual topic, the reason why we're all here. Tacitus. Why Tacitus? Well, in some respects, I've kind of roped you all into something that has become a recent obsession of mine. I don't know why it is that Tacitus is so damn interesting. And you'll pardon the vulgarities from time to time. I'm used to speaking amongst friends, but truth, there's no reason why truth cannot also be pursued with a little bit of passionate vulgarity. Why is Tacitus so damn interesting? Well, I hope that as you engage, as you travel along on this journey with me, that it will be as beneficial for you as it certainly will be for me. With that being said, I should emphasize that this is a bit of a strange seminar insofar as nobody speaking today, to the best of my knowledge, is an expert on Tacitus. There are no Tacitus scholars here today, and given the present state of academia, I should consider that an advantage. We are simply individuals in a long tradition of thinkers who are interested in the great works of the past. And in that sense, we join some of the greatest minds who have ever lived. For example, Machiavelli and Guicciardini, Renaissance Italian thinkers, were very heavily influenced by Tacitus. Guicciardini, for example, said that Tacitus teaches people living under a tyranny how to deal with living under a tyranny, and he teaches tyrants how to rule. So he gets both sides of the coin there. The French thinker Montaigne had said that Tacitus is the perfect antidote to our sickly nation. He seems to be narrating and berating us for all of our problems. Montesquieu had said that Tacitus summarizes everything because he has seen everything. Similarly, some of the American founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, they corresponded with each other. They had a great respect for Tacitus. In fact, Jefferson had said that in a letter to Adams in 1812 that he had given up reading newspapers. There's all crap going on in the world. Doesn't that sound familiar? And he had taken to reading Tacitus and Thucydides, and he was much the happier for it. In the far less often quoted response, though, Adams said that, of course, he has read Tacitus and Thucydides, but he says he tends to avoid them because reading about all of the hypocrisy and internecine quarrels and strife reminds him too much of his own time. Adams considered Tacitus, the morality of Tacitus, to be the morality of patriotism. Jefferson considered Tacitus to be the greatest writer ever. And he was influential not just for political theorists, but also for literary figures. The French playwrights Corneille and Racine, for example, were big into Tacitus. Racine had said that Tacitus was the greatest painter of antiquity. Indeed, there's a certain literary quality to Tacitus, which bears mentioning. Edward Gibbon, of course, was heavily influenced by him. And not all of the people who were influenced by Tacitus were fans of him, mind you. Voltaire said that Tacitus, he didn't really like Tacitus all that much because he found him too obscure. It wasn't direct enough. Weren't quite sure what he was on about. And it's true, there are a lot of ambiguities in Tacitus, not all of which can be ironed out, and I'm sure we'll discuss several of them today. Napoleon considered Tacitus a mere pamphleteer. He thought that he disliked Tacitus because Tacitus was the kind of guy who derided statesmen or revealed them to be tyrants, and then he patted himself on the back as if he had done a good job doing so, which may say a little bit more about Napoleon than it does about Tacitus. And finally, in our own era, or well, I should say 50, 60, 70 years ago, one of the scholars who was a cut above all the rest in his own time, and certainly in our own time, Sir Ronald Syme, in his 2-volume work on Tacitus, says, "It is good fortune and a privilege if one can consort for so many years with an historian who knew the worst, discovered few reasons for ease or hope or confidence, and nonetheless believed in human dignity and freedom of speech." So with that said, a few words on Tacitus's life, and it won't take very long because we don't know that much. Not as much as we know about a guy like Cicero, for example. He was born in 56 or 57 AD. Where? We're not even totally certain about that. Probably in Narbonnensis Gaul, so modern-day Languedoc-Provence in France. The next thing we know about him is that he gets married in 77, so he's young. He's about 20, 21 years old. At that time, marriage was a way that you could actually get the age, the minimum age requirement for doing the cursus honorum, for taking political office. You could get that reduced by getting married. So marriage has its benefits, in other words. The next thing we know about him is that in 88 AD, he's a praetor. And we only know that because he mentions that in his annals. Tacitus was almost famously reluctant to really say anything about himself at all, unlike his good buddy Pliny, who loves talking about himself and everything. He's a praetor in 88, but he's also a member of one of the priestly colleges, the Quindecimviri, the 15 people were part of this particular college. This is an important point because becoming elected or appointed or whatever to a priestly college was a very prestigious position. But normally it happened after you were a consul. The fact that Tacitus held this position already prior to being a consul would indicate that he was in rather good with the Flavian regime. And so I'm speaking of the emperors Vespasian from 69 to 79, Titus, his son, from 79 to 81, and then Domitian, his other son, from 81 to 96. And indeed, Tacitus says at the beginning of his histories that his career got a massive boost from all three of these emperors. And then after his praetorship, he seems to be out of Rome for a period of time, including probably during some of Domitian's worst years, the very end of Domitian's reign, so 93, 94, 95. The next thing we know of him is that in 97 AD, he holds the consulship. Not the great consulship as people held under the Republic, where you gave your name to the year, you and your co-consul, but rather the suffect consulship. This is one of the sort of secondary consuls. This is the position that you were elected to later on in the year, maybe around September or so, and you held it for a few months, so that way you could have more consuls in the year, so more people could partake of that honor that had grown to be so hollow by that point, living under the emperors. However, during that year, 97, and now the emperor is Nerva, we've moved past the Flavians, and we're now at the beginning of the era called the Five Good Emperors. That's what Machiavelli called it, and Gibbon said that it was during this time period that man was at his happiest and flourished the most. Tacitus was consul in 97, and he would have been privy to the Praetorian Guards storming the palace in October of 97 and forcing Nerva not only to seek vengeance on Domitian's killers, because the Praetorian Guard, they quite liked Domitian, but also forcing Nerva to choose a successor that would please them, and that was Trajan, the military emperor, who would later go on to rule for almost 20 years. So Tacitus would have been privy to this. After his consulship, what does he do? He starts writing. We have some minor works. In 98, the Agricola, a work about his father-in-law, Julius Agricola. We have the Germania, an ethnographic treatise on the Germanies, on the various tribes there. Then the dialogue on orators in 102. After that, he becomes proconsul. He begins working on his first work of history, which is the Histories, and that outlines the time period for the Flavian era from 69 to 96. Then he's proconsul of Asia from summer of 112 to 113, and then he starts working on the Annals, his other great historical work. We only have them in fragmentary form, unfortunately, and they really did get through by the skin of their teeth. It's thanks to two monasteries, Monte Cassino, from which we have the latter half of the Annals, books, partially book 11 through to book 16, partially that, and then the Histories, books 1 through 4 and a little bit of book 5. One manuscript for that. And then Corvey Abbey in Germany, where we have the first 6 books, almost complete, of Tacitus's Annals. That's essentially it. We don't know if he finished the Annals, and we don't know exactly when he died. We suspect he lived into Hadrian's reign, maybe died around 120 AD. Apart from that, we really don't know a lot else about him, except he did seem to like hunting. That was one of his big hobbies. Pliny mentions that in his first letter to Tacitus. Okay, enough from me on Tacitus's life and everything. What I'd like to do is I'm going to turn it over to our two speakers. We're going to start with Titus, and he's going to speak about Tacitus's first work, the Agricola. And then immediately afterwards, because there's going to be some overlap between their presentations, we're just going to go straight over to Matt, who will speak about civilization and barbarism, or barbarians, in Tacitus, focusing mainly on the Agricola and the Germania. And after that, we will go into general discussion where you can ask questions, bring up points, and let's see where it goes from there, and we'll do our best to moderate it. So, Titus, please.
Hello, my name is Titus. Scott and Mario invited me to speak on this question of imperial overstretch and decadence. The epitome of imperial power is Augustus, and everything after that somehow every victory produces a catastrophe. Every big campaign leads to anything from dynastic change and civil war to, on the other hand, massive purges and all sorts of crimes against senatorial families, ambitious men, etc. Tacitus, as Scott has said, somehow managed to survive better than most, if not all, the famous Romans of the first century. This is somehow of importance, but we don't know why, because Tacitus is famously terse in style and keeps private things private. He mentions that he was favored by Agricola, the subject of my talk here, with the marriage of his daughter in his consulship year, Agricola's. He does not say what the woman's name was. That's private. Public things he will talk about, not private things. And what he considers to be private and how he deals with it, however, is very difficult to say. This is why reading him is difficult, and this is why I would say his works tend to be on the short side. You cannot tolerate this kind of style for too long. Something that is both, it can seem at times pedantic and moralistic, and at times it can seem very obscure. He talks about things he does not explain what he talks about, and they have no relation to his story. He has, these are all characteristics of the ancient art of writing, but, and in that sense, I think Scott is right to compare him somehow to Thucydides, as Jefferson and Adams did, and other writers. Thucydides is also strangely mysterious for a historian, but they have a very important difference, of course. From the point of view of Tacitus, universal monarchy is a realized fact, and this creates enormous dangers for thinkers like himself. And on the other hand, the world of the Romans is transforming altogether. Agricola is the subject of his first, so to speak, writing, because he is, in a certain sense, the last of the Romans. Agricola is a man who behaves in the way in which Roman politicians did hundreds of years before. You read his life, and from his political activity to his military activity, he seems to be one of the great heroes of the Republic. He could be another Fabius Maximus, he could be another Cincinnatus. He seems to belong among those great men. Tacitus insists on this by introducing him, or introducing the whole subject and the whole book, as saying that virtue used to matter a lot for Romans, so much so that they talked about it at length, and it was such a normal thing for them to do that even speaking about one's own career, writing one's own life, was not frowned upon. It was considered neither arrogant nor partisan, that is to say, given to boasting or to lies. The Romans do not seem to have an interiority. They live by their deeds, and deeds can be spoken because they are essentially of a public character. This is why when one speaks one's life, one isn't liable to suspicion. Tacitus suggests that he is different by making excuses for what he is doing and alleging the piety of his concern, writing the life of his father-in-law, a notable man. He is different. He has much to be silent about. The Rome that Tacitus is talking about is no longer the Rome that Agricola thinks he embodies. It is a Rome that is in a certain way barbaric. Tacitus makes this obvious by introducing the work of the Agricola as somehow dealing with the radical disjunction between tyrannic emperors on the one hand, who slaughter all sorts of noblemen, real Romans, let's say, and on the other hand, the work of the philosophers like Tacitus, like the Stoics, with whom he begins, who got themselves killed by their imprudence, and indeed all the teachers as such. The various of the beastly emperors, Nero and Domitian especially, were in the habit of banishing philosophers or killing them, he says, because they did not want anything that was free or noble to remind people of their ancient freedoms, or you could say of their natural ambitions and powers. And so Tacitus is forced partly by circumstances, partly by his own nature, to be much more discreet than somebody like Agricola or indeed the ancient politicians had been. This is the difficulty in interpreting his work. He is obviously not in favor of these tyrannic emperors and perhaps not in favor of the monarchy as such. He is very polite. He says that Nerva and then Trajan, two men of very different character, as Scott alluded to, somehow managed to put liberty and monarchy together, which had previously been considered impossible. But if this were so, of course, he should be speaking openly and somehow praising the situation. He is not. He says that, in fact, even if we are to recover some of Roman virtue, it will be like recovering from a disease. It's much easier to waste your health than to get it back, he says. That is the nature of human infirmity. So in politics, so with the body. In fact, Rome is not free. It can never again be free. Something has transformed in the character of the people, not merely in the character of the emperors. The character of the emperor somehow shows a horrible barbarism. Agricola cannot see this himself. He is of the opinion largely that barbarism is on the outskirts of empire, and that's where he goes for his career. To go on the outskirts of empire is to awaken the ancient Roman virtues. The armies on the frontiers, in this case in Britain, have to be tough, have to be obedient at the same time, have to be more enterprising, and have to be more enduring their adversaries. The Romans do not have the natural strengths of the Britons, including knowledge of the land, but they do have things the Britons do not have. They plan in advance, and they can outlast their enemies. They are much more of an engineering race, you can say, and they are much more, not prudent, but at least cautious. Caution, however, is not a species of courage, it is a species of cowardice. It is a noble species of cowardice, but it is a species of cowardice. It might be strange to think of Roman virtue as somehow tied up with cowardice, but Tacitus makes it clear that the whole point of settling great generals on the borders of empire is that Rome is always afraid. Rome is always afraid that somewhere on the border, some barbaric tribe will break through. Why should we have such a concern for this border situation? Obviously, all these tribes on the Roman borders do not feel the same. Neither Britons in this case nor the Germans in the subsequent case feel so threatened by the Romans as the Romans feel by them. This is because somehow empire no longer has a principle of cohesion. That is to say, there is no connection between the great virtues shown at the border, where generals can make or break the empire, and whatever it is that central imperial administration in Rome might be. In one sense, it might be a great emperor, it might be a corrupt emperor, it might be an indifferent emperor, and however he administers Rome and the legions. But they are not connected. Tacitus suggests this by proving that Agricola, by achieving greatness in the most modest and obliging and obedient way, got himself killed by a beast, Domitian. This is the oddity of the work. It's narrating the life of a great man whose greatness is his downfall through no fault of his own, unless we call prudence a virtue and his fall a sign of imprudence. This is where one begins to get in dangerous waters with Tacitus. There's no reason to doubt that he admired his father-in-law and that he was pious, as he says in his introduction, but he is deeply critical of him. Agricola thought that you could still be a virtuous Roman as they had been in the ancient times, if only at the border, if only against barbaric tribes. For the conquest and the pacification of these lands, since only world conquest can give Rome security. Only after the entire world is conquered, there are no more barbarian tribes at any borders, will people feel safe. Only then, so to speak, can cowardice stop leading people to war. It may be a strange thing to think about that cowardice could be a cause of war, but that seems to be the teaching of Tacitus. One can look further to the Annals and to other works to show that Augustus set the borders of empire not because he was a moderate man, but because he believed it was no longer feasible. You could say perhaps for reasons of technology, telecommunications, transportation, but still it was not feasible to expand the empire further. Augustus was a moderate emperor, despite the fact that he was not a moderate man and he did not lead moderate men. The Romans are very moderate. But they do understand the limits of their enterprise. And so even in the Agricola, Tacitus points to this, that Augustus, unlike Caesar, had no ambition to conquer or even visit Britain. This happened only in the mid-century, once emperors became again dangerously ambitious, and this led to the success of Vespasian, who is in a certain sense usurper. The death of Nero ushers in the civil war. Various contending emperors do all the barbaric things imaginable to fellow Romans, and Vespasian comes out on top and installs this new dynasty. And of course, Agricola himself then is a great success in Britain, like Vespasian himself had been sent by Vespasian, and the result of it is that he is recalled to Rome and murdered because Domitian rightly fears popular discontent. Catastrophes on other borders forced Domitian to either send Agricola to put down the enemies of Rome, secure the empire, and therefore claim the throne, or on the other hand, kill him right now and just take his losses on the border. And he does the cautious thing. Again, caution is often the cause of horror in Tacitus. This is especially obvious in the histories and the annals, but it is also the political situation is described by the Agricola specifically. Were the great Agricolas to achieve even further imperial greatness through the use of the legions, then the legions themselves and the people would force him to become emperor. It doesn't matter how obedient he is. What matters is that what he is doing in his obedience is catastrophic for the continuance of the dynasty, for the continuance of Roman politics. Nothing is more dangerous for a beast of an emperor than a great man for a general. This is the contradiction that leads Tacitus to develop the full conflict of Roman politics and, in a sense, the conflict of human nature. Agricola, unlike Domitian, wishes to achieve some kind of natural virtue, and that is to say, virtue in accordance with the requirements of his missions, the requirements of the peoples he's dealing with, the requirements of the military affairs, not virtue in accordance with obedience to one emperor or another simply. So this attempt by Agricola is also said to have to do with his childhood. His political status comes from his grandfathers, who had risen in the equestrian order in the service of empire, and his father, who had risen into the senatorial order, and then got himself killed. Of his father, he says not just that he got himself killed, of Agricola's father that is, but that he also was a student of philosophy. And that Agricola himself strove to study philosophy as a young man, but he was stopped from it by his mother. This, I think, to wrap everything up, is the key to the Agricola and to the intention of Tacitus in the work and to his intention as a philosophical thinker altogether, since introductory works tend to introduce the entire view and the entire enterprise. Agricola did not have the studies of a philosopher, and therefore his idea of human greatness, or you could say natural virtue as opposed to political convention or obedience to a monarch, his view of it was very, very limited. Agricola discovered his own powers through service. It turns out that he had a remarkable ability to blend the ruthlessness necessary for Roman warfare with the civility, even gentleness, required for civil affairs. This points to something truly great in the man that somehow never played out properly. You could say that if you looked at the military and domestic requirements, Agricola shows one possible combination of them and Tacitus the other. Agricola is a great man who has done great deeds. Tacitus achieved incredible successes among emperors who were quite beastly and yet is very obscure. Agricola shows what the past of Rome was like, and you could say it was dedicated to the proposition that deeds speak for themselves. If you think about that, it's a very funny thing to think. Indeed, the Romans did become writers, despite their opinion that deeds speak for themselves. If deeds spoke for themselves, they would not need speakers. They would not need what we would call intellectuals today. Yes. Tacitus dedicated himself to the correlative possibility that, at least in certain ages, politics requires a certain obscurity. It requires a certain discretion, and the daring of man should not be in warlike deeds as in Agricola, but another kind of daring that we see in the work of Tacitus himself. You could say that for all his daring, his inadequacy of education has to do with the fact that Agricola never asked himself the fundamental question of the regime. What is it possible to do under this kind of monarchy? He attempted things that he should not have attempted, that endangered the empire and got him killed, because he thought that the something of the old Rome was still around. And you could say that in that belief, he was not merely fondly deluded, he was not brave. For all his military daring, he had no political daring. Tacitus himself shows throughout his work an unusual political daring by describing altogether the transformation under the monarchy of the Roman principles of politics. What happens to people if they can only feel they are virtuous anymore at the borders when they are engaged in war? I'll conclude with this remark. The annals begin with the reign of Augustus and the catastrophes of his chosen heirs. These people, Drusus and Germanicus, one of them behaves the Roman way when he is faced with a mutiny. He plays on the superstitions of his armies, he figures out who are the ringleaders of a mutiny and brutally gets rid of them. And he solves the problem. Germanicus does not behave that way. He has bigger armies to deal with and problems to deal with, and he's just crazy. He gets lots of people killed in massacres, he almost gets himself killed and his multiple times and his imperial family. He's absolutely incompetent, he's full of guilt and tries to make everybody feel guilty, and then leads everybody on a strange invasion of Germany to avenge another army that had been wiped out famously under Augustus. And all of this turns out to be a catastrophe. These are two paths that Tacitus shows for the Roman way. The path of Drusus does not follow, doesn't have any kind of follow-up. He dies. But Germanicus gives the dynasty. His child is Caligula, and then later on Nero appears. A new kind of monarchy, a new kind of Rome is born in that beginning, where these crazy things happen, all sorts of political struggles that somehow have to do with guilt and bloody-minded sacrifices of Roman soldiers by Roman soldiers in the midst of disobedience and mutiny. Roman character has changed in a fundamental way, and it takes a great daring to see. This, I would say, is the briefest articulation I can offer of the problem Mario began with. What does it mean to look steadfastly at decadence, not to blink in front of catastrophes that follow from the change in character and the change in belief, and what it means to become aware of the fact that all sorts of dangerous beliefs are driving people to say and do insane things. I would say that this is why we study Tacitus now. He is the best writer on decadence and the most steadfast, and in a way the best educator for what it means to see a world go crazy without going crazy oneself, and therefore is an educator of prudence, not of military greatness as that of Agricola, but of political greatness, which must include the possibility that in certain ages there is not so much that can be done or said, certainly not publicly, and that many things have to be kept secrets. Indeed, in the beginning of the Agricola, he says that it's one thing not to be able to speak, it's another thing to not remember. Memory lasts a lot longer than speech does. There is an interiority in man, a capacity to withstand even catastrophes, because there are things we can know even when we cannot say them, just like there are things that we can say even when we cannot do them. And so there seems to be, we say that he suggests that in their wickedness, the wicked tyrants like Nero and Domitian knew what they were doing when they were trying to destroy the philosophers. They're trying to destroy the possibilities of learning, which also include memory of whatever is discovered. And Tacitus suggests that his represents a path that avoids the catastrophes into which other politicians or other philosophers got themselves by being insufficiently prudent and insufficiently confident of the specific powers of thought as opposed to deed. Thank you.
Thanks, all right, we'll go straight over to Matthew Edwards.
Thanks, Scott. I'm going to be talking broadly about barbarians. They make many regular appearances in a lot of Tacitus's works. It's hardly surprising the periods that the annals and histories cover ones of expansion for Rome, and the empire was hardly moving into unpopulated areas. There happened to be annoying people there who considered the place that the Romans were marching into their own territory. Yet it's more than just the historical account that Tacitus presents of this campaign or that campaign, this bunch of hairy savages clashing with Roman arms. There's an element of that, obviously, well, the first part anyway. Because the picture that Tacitus gives us of the barbarians, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, air quotes, is one that is nuanced, detailed, and provides us with some very important insights into pre-migration period, pre-Wanderung, non-Roman Europe. There's many aspects that can be drawn out of this, so I hope you forgive me if just a couple I will focus on, and hopefully they'll be of interest. I'm going to look at how Tacitus portrays barbarians, how he describes them, presents them, and contrast some of the portrayal of so-called barbarian behaviour with that of the apparently civilised behaviour of his own world, of Rome. And then I'm going to talk about some of the possible reasons for Tacitus's interest in the barbarian question, in particular those in the area of what would become Germany. The main works, as Scott mentioned in his introduction, that I'll be drawing on the Agricola and the Germania, though inevitably I will also be referencing at times the annals and the histories. So to begin, who are these barbarians that are mentioned in the Agricola? First off, let's get rid of any Wagnerian imagery that we have in our heads. Goths and barbarians did not wear horns on their helmets. I'll point out here, Tacitus does use the word barbarian and barbarous at times as an adjective, but it's not that often. More regularly, he speaks of a particular tribe of the peoples or people involved, rather than casting them all together as an other. These two works, the Agricola and the Germania, cover those people living outside of the Roman world, and who are very evidently outside of Rome's imperium, well, in the Agricola at least for part of it. The Germania looks at those peoples to the east of the Rhine and the north of the Danube, the Germanic peoples. The Agricola covers the Celtic Britons, in particular those in what was called Caledonia, what is now Scotland. The two works had very different purposes. The Agricola is a biographical work, the Germania an ethnographic study. Indeed, it's one of the only ethnographic studies we have from the Roman period. It's therefore not surprising that there is considerably more detail, from a historical point of view, there's considerably more detail provided of Iron Age tribes in the Germania than there is of their counterparts in Britain. What is interesting, though, is that when you then reference the annals, this is clear that this is not a lack of knowledge on the part of Tacitus. It's merely fitting in with the style of writing in the Agricola. The annals provide significant detail of the various Celtic tribes, including in Britain. In the Germania, Tacitus, just to give a brief intro for those who may not be fully conversant with it, Tacitus provides an overview and summarisation of the peoples in Germania of that time, covering geography, origin stories, ethnic traits, economic activity, military systems, hierarchical and social systems, religion, women, crime and punishment, governance methods, rural life, virtue, and social standards. He describes the locations and characteristics of the many different tribes in, say, what we basically would now call parts of the Low Countries, Germany, Denmark, bits of Poland even, Austria as well, and gives a brief mention of their relationship with Rome. He mentions, among others, names such as the Suebi, the Marcomanni, who would become well known later on with Marcus Aurelius, the Quadi, Suiones, Lugi, and the Gothones. Knowledge that Tacitus has is obviously greater the closer the tribe in question is to the Rhine frontier. The Gothones are mentioned briefly, for instance, as being on one of the still seas where the waters do not move. This is the Baltic, and where they are actually thought to have come from the Swedish island of Gotland. The descriptions that Tacitus gives us of these tribes has been subject to a considerable degree of scrutiny, which has been harsh at times, scrutiny, and has pointed out some of the problems of Tacitus's coverage of the tribes. Some are geographically not exactly where they are now believed to have been. Issue is taken with some of the language that Tacitus uses. For example, Mercury is the chief deity whom they worship, rather than using a Germanic name for the god. And there are questions over some of the social hierarchical descriptions that he uses. The use to which, and it does need to be brought up, the use to which the Germania was put under National Socialism has intensified this scrutiny and made Tacitus's name mud in some circles. Adam Lund has examined this in detail, as Christopher Krebs. It's interesting that the phrasing, the name that has been given to the Germania as a very dangerous book has come up again and again in recent years. Some people seem to think that by attacking Tacitus, one is attacking the ideological underpinnings of National Socialism. Yet when one actually looks back to Tacitus' description of the tribes in the Germania and the behaviour of barbarians in the Agricola, barbarians in quotation marks again, one suddenly becomes aware that he is presenting a very nuanced, very socially complex picture, and one that he's making clear is of a very often erudite and capable people. There is a lot that can be said about the use of speeches in antiquity and the recording of speeches. The question of accuracy of speeches is an infamous one. Famously, Thucydides openly says that where he does not know what the speech will be, he writes, if not what was exactly said, then what it was in line with the intention of the individual to have said. He's more honest than most, but there are hints that Tacitus follows exactly the same. He says in some of his speeches that the individual in question said something like this. For Tacitus, this is even more so an issue because he often portrays speeches that are given by the other side, the enemy in many of these cases, speeches in non-literary societies, and ones that are often given during conflict. I think it's fair to say that we don't think there would have been when some of these speeches that are given during the rebellions in Britain were said, there's not going to be somebody there writing it down in Latin, making sure all the cases are correct, and then taking a copy of it down to deliver to the nearest Roman writer, who then makes sure that it gets put into the record. The use of speeches in Roman historiography is an interesting one, and I'd actually recommend a book by Eric Adler, who's done some very fascinating work from that, not just on Tacitus, but also on Cassius Dio, Suetonius, and others. So looking at 3 examples from Tacitus, I won't quote at length because some of these speeches are long, but just a few sentences from each. The first two are taken from the Annals. The first is that of Caractacus, who was king of a tribe in what's now England, who led resistance to the Roman invasion under Claudius in AD 43 and onwards. He was betrayed and taken to Rome. So, quote from Tacitus: "The reputation of Caractacus had spread beyond the islands and through the neighbouring provinces to Italy itself. These people were curious to see the man who had defied our power for so many years. Even at Rome, his name meant something. Besides, the emperor's attempts to glorify himself conferred additional glory on Caractacus in defeat, for the people were summoned as though for a fine spectacle, while the guards stood in arms on the parade ground before their camp. Then there was a march pass, with Caractacus's petty vassals and the decorations and neck chains and spoils of his foreign wars. Next were displayed his brother's wife and daughter. Last came the king himself. The others, frightened, degraded themselves by entreaties. But there were no downcast looks or appeals for mercy from Caractacus. On reaching the dais, he spoke in these terms." So this is Tacitus now quoting Caractacus, or saying what he says Caractacus said. "If the degree of my nobility and fortune had been matched by moderation and success, I would have come to this city as a friend rather than as a captive, nor would you have disdained to receive with a treaty of peace one sprung from brilliant ancestors and commanding a great many nations. But my present lot, disfiguring as it is for me, is magnificent for you," addressing Claudius. "I had horses, men, arms, and wealth. What wonder if I was unwilling to lose them? If you wish to command everyone, does it really follow that everyone should accept your slavery? If I were now being handed over as one who had surrendered immediately, neither my fortune nor your glory would have achieved brilliance. If you execute me, they will be forgotten. Spare me, and I shall be an eternal example of your clemency." Later in the Annals, Tacitus then gives the words of Boadicea, of the Iceni, on the eve of the last battle of the famous Iceni revolt. Being successful, it had sacked several Roman cities in southern England, and this was how she said: "But I'm not fighting for my kingdom and wealth now. I'm fighting as an ordinary person for my lost freedom, my bruised body, and the outraged chastity of my daughters. Nowadays, Roman rapacity does not even spare our bodies. Old people are killed, virgins raped, but the gods will grant us the vengeance we deserve. The Roman legion which dare to fight is annihilated. The rest cower from their camps or watch from a distance to escape. They will never face the din and roar of our thousands, much less the shock of our onslaught. Consider how many you are fighting and why. Then you will win this battle or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will." And finally, from the Agricola. This is part of a speech of Calicus. Again, a motivational speech, but one that has gone down famously. "Former contests in which, with varying fortune, the Romans were resisted, still left us, at last, with hope of succour, inasmuch as being the most renowned nation of Britain, dwelling in the very heart of the country, and out of the sights of the shores of the conquered, we could keep even our eyes unpolluted by the contagion of slavery. To us, who dwell on the uttermost confines of the earth and of freedom, this remote sanctuary and seclusion has up to this time been a defence. Now, however, the furthest limits of Britain are thrown open. There are no more tribes beyond us, nothing indeed but waves and rocks, and the yet more terrible Romans, from whom oppression and escape is vaguely sought by obedience and submission. Robbers of the world, having by their universal plunder exhausted the land, they ransack the sea. If the enemy be rich, they are rapacious. If he be poor, they lust for dominion. Neither the east nor the west has been able to satisfy them. Alone among men they covet with equal eagerness poverty and riches. To robbery, slaughter and plunder they give the lying name of empire. They create a desolation and call it peace." It's fair to say these are not favourable pictures of Rome that Tacitus is presenting, even accepting, shall we say euphemistically, somewhat different social governance and military campaigning norms in the 1st century AD compared to today. Events in Britain had crossed the line multiple times, and Tacitus admits this. In the Annals, the Iceni revolt is recorded as starting after an allied tribe to Rome, Boadicea herself, after she and her daughters were raped by local Roman soldiers and were not allowed to inherit what was rightfully theirs. At times, poor command decisions and incompetent leadership are depicted. Even in the Agricola, loquacious and erudite words condemn some Roman actions. And just as a side note, that last sentence of Calgacus, they created desolation and call it peace, ubi solitudinem faciunt pacem appellant. There are various translations that say they have made a desert and call it peace. I can't think of anybody in antiquity other than a tribal leader in Scotland who would less know what a desert is like. Please don't use the word desert. All of this, aside from that little rant, returns us to a theme that underpins much of Tacitus's work: wealth, power, corruption. The use of power for self-gain, the use of the state for self-enrichment and self-glorification. Others will speak later about questions of power, the growth of decadence, and so on. So I don't want to go into that in too much detail. Alas, indeed, that we don't have some of the works in the annals of Caligula, because I'm sure those would be interesting to read if we were really wanting to look into decadence. But there are reoccurring themes that Tacitus raises in his work that contrasts the behaviour and action of supposed barbarians against that of the supposed virtuous Romans. The term the noble savage would not be coined for centuries, but there are echoes. Compare the description that I read earlier, the first of the 3 speeches, of Caractacus facing his likely death. And standing there, as he says, not begging for his life, speaking and standing tall. Compare that with descriptions of Claudius, which are ambivalent, in Tacitus to say the least, or later of Nero. Of course, a historian can only work with events and people as they are, and with events as how they have taken place, as long as the historian doesn't take liberties. Suetonius, cough. But even with the descriptions, there are a clear nobility of action in parts and nobility of bearing in the supposed barbarians, in Caractacus, that stands in contrast with later the whining, pathetic man-child of Nero. As Tacitus says of Nero's early years, scandalous publicity did not satiate him. Indeed, it led him on. Places of assignation and taverns were built, and every stimulus to vice was displayed for sale. Respectable people were compelled to spend money, disreputable people did so gladly. Promiscuity and degradation Roman morals had long become impure, but never was there so favourable an environment for debauchery. Of course, the idea of wealth corrupting is not new, and of power corrupting is hardly new. Tacitus was not the first to comment on this. It has been an ongoing theme in Rome since the end of the Second Punic War and the wars in Spain in the 2nd century BC, when wealth and slaves had started to flood back into Rome. Cato the Elder, also known as Cato the Censor, put it quite nicely in 195 BC. We have crossed into Greece and Asia, places filled with all the allurements of vice, and we are handling the treasures of kings. I fear these things will capture us rather than we them. Tacitus makes it clear that he certainly believes some of that. But the comparison of this with the apparent nobler, simpler, more honourable life that Tacitus repeatedly presents barbarians as having is interesting. This comes out repeatedly in the Germania. And so why this interest in barbarians? Was it just as a useful comparison with the decadence of Rome, the poor actions of the barbarous actions of emperors? Why did Tacitus have this enduring sense of inquiry into the other, into those in the woods on the other side of the Rhine and Danube? Why did he write the Germania? We can, unfortunately, only speculate, or fortunately, as it gives me something to talk about. Let's look at his interest as possibly being given by one of two factors, either professional or personal ones. Let's take the Germania. Written in the start of his career, a couple of years into the reign of Nerva, as we heard, but at a point when it was clear that a more active, military-focused Trajan will soon be taking over. Now, from a professional point of view, and having been an analyst in government, the Germania is categorised as an ethnographic study. It doesn't read like that to me. It reads like an aid memoir. It reads like a baseline study. It reads like a document you give to policymakers who don't really know the subject, that they can flick through and refer to and understand, getting a base understanding of an area at speed. It's a summarisation of knowledge. Categories are all there: geography, leadership structures, social norms, systems of authority, law, military, etc. Could it be that Tacitus at that point was tasked by someone higher up the food chain to draw up a baseline study? Something to go into a briefing pack? Was this one of a couple of documents? History has only left us with the Germania as an example of the ethnographic studies. Was somebody else writing a Dacia? Was somebody else writing a Parthia? Of course, there are arguments against this. It would be too easy if there weren't. The language in the Germania is flowery at times. There are some mistakes. And there is always the great argument that Tacitus was working off second-hand indirect accounts. All true. But then, when is direct expertise ever a prerequisite in the public sector? And let's be honest, most information that everybody deals with is second or third hand. That Tacitus had not been to Germania makes little difference. The number of Romans by the time of his life that had really been into Germania was vanishingly small as a part of the population. The process of gathering information, collating it, compiling it, assessing it, casting some aside and drawing conclusions, that's standard analytical behaviour. Yes, it's done by historians. It's also done by tens of thousands of analysts working for governments around the world every day. Or in business as well, I should point out. So that's one possible, probably erroneous, hypothesis for the Germania. What about others? What about personal drivers for this? Tacitus was clearly interested in history, in past events, in peoples and situations around his time. He would hardly be the first person to spend years, months researching something and writing about it just because he found it interesting, and then publishing it with no discernible customer base or clear point. Let's be honest, that's how a lot of academic journals survive these days. And I'm sure there are enough people with PhDs here to appreciate the idea of writing something for no monetary reward or glory. Aren't there, Dr. Nelson? And
it was glory indeed. Mario mentioned my book at the beginning, at the outset.
Oh, so defensive. And of course, Tacitus was a public servant. At the time when he was writing these, he was getting paid no matter what he was doing and up to on the side. Just but only to a point. He was in the position of being able to indulge his interests, to be able to afford to spend time doing research and writing, even at the early stage in his career. And later, as we said, when it said in the introduction, when writing the annals, the histories, he had passed through the cursus honorum and had come out the other side, alive and prosperous, as far as we can tell. Time to retire to the country, sit on the terrace, sip wine and write books. I'm sure we could all think of worse ways to spend our life. But were there other reasons, more personal ones, beyond just a general interest in the other or in what had happened in his country? Maybe something in the family background, something that hints at a family involvement with barbarians. And I'm not just talking about him being proto-French and feeling an internal worry in his DNA about Germans coming across the Rhine. Tacitus is notoriously cagey about his antecedents. As mentioned, the bets are that he was from Narbonensis or Italia Transpardena, and that the family was Novohomos, new men. We know through his connections with Pliny that there was a Cornelius Tacitus who was a financial agent up in Gallia Belgica, and that he was responsible as procurator of Belgica and the two Germanies for financial collections in those areas. So there was likely a father or an uncle up that end of the Roman world dealing with the German and Gallic tribes. And a singular line from some of the works of Pliny the Elder suggests he may have died after Tacitus was born, soon after Tacitus was born. It wouldn't be the first time that a son has been interested in something that his father was doing, especially if it meant that he was away from home, and started looking at that as part of something greater. We can throw it back one further. Why was his father up in Belgica? Why was his father up there? Part of it was just the usual, was it partly the usual postings that Roman civil servants did? Or was it something else? There's hints that the family were the new freedman ones. That's debated. But if so, was his father up there longer term? Was the family ancestry up there? At least one side of it. Or did he know people up there? Then we get to more long-standing involvement up in Belgica and Germania. Not impossible. And we start linking it in to some of the things he actually narrates in the annals. The campaigns of Germanicus, the settlement beyond the Rhine that had to be abandoned after Teutoburg Forest, Arminius Varus, all those. Now, I'm not suggesting that part of Tacitus's family was at the massacre of the Teutoburg Forest, but an element of family history and family involvement and wish to explore his own background through writing annals and through writing the histories does and well could account for some of his enduring interest in this. I'll pause there. Obviously, there's lots more we could talk about, and happy to draw out some of the other themes, but I'll pass back to Scott.
All right. Thanks a lot, Matt.